This is part 2 of the Craftsman King Seeley 100 drill press rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 1, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to begin disassembly of this drill press. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. The first thing I'm going to do is apply PB Blaster. This is a penetrating lubricant. Pretty much around the column where it meets the different parts, the head, the table, and the base. Next, I'm going to go ahead and remove the motor mount bolts that are on each side of the head. And then we're going to push the motor in and remove the belt. Then we're going to go ahead and test the motor. So turn it on, and it runs just fine. And I heard the click, so we're good to go. We can go ahead and remove the motor. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove that drill bit that's in the chuck. And then we're going to release the tension on the tension knob for the spring. And that was the lock screw that's on the bottom there. And then the knob itself. When you do that, make sure you've got a good handle on the knob so it doesn't slip out of your hand like it did on me. Next, we're going to remove the feed stop rod. And it's got a nut on the bottom of it. And then we're going to go ahead and remove the screw, the nut, and the lock washer that's on the feed stop bracket. Then we can pull that rod straight up out of there. Now I'm doing this because the two feed stop collars that are on that feed stop rod are incorrect and they won't come off of there real easily. So we'll work on that later. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove the feed handle rods that are on the hub. I was able to get two of them off. One of them is in there pretty good, so I'll show you how we remove that later on. So the pinion didn't have its lock nut here, but for whatever reason, it's still in there pretty tight. So I'm just using a wooden dowel to kind of force it out the other side. Next, we're just going to remove the Quill spindle assembly so we can unlock the Quill lock and then figure out what it's binding on. It just needed to be canted a little bit and then it came out, no problem. And then we're going to go ahead and remove that Quill lock with a wooden dowel. All these bores seem to be really tight, so I think there's just a lot of grit in there. So we'll go ahead and remove the handle, screw, and the sleeve, and then the nut itself. We just pop that out. There we go. Next, I'm removing the machine screws that hold the spindle pulley assembly in the head. There's two of these, one on each side. They came out no problem, except that I dropped them. And then we're going to use a wooden dowel and get it to sit just on the bottom of the spindle pulley assembly. And then we can start smacking it with that mallet. And that'll force the two bearings through their bores, and there's the assembly. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a column collar on the column directly below the head, because I got a feeling this head's going to be a bear to get off of here. with all the grit that's on the column. So we're going to go ahead and remove the head lock. We'll knock the lock nut out of there. And then the lock sleeve going through the other side. Sorry, my concrete floor is not level, so. All right, so the next thing is the head. Theoretically, we should be able to just lift it straight up off of there, but it's binding right there. So some more PB Blaster. We'll get it back down. Get it to line up with the other bore. Right there. That's why we've got that column collar on there. And then we can just work it and try to go straight up with it. And we're really close. We're right here. We're about 1/4 of an inch away from getting it off the column. So I'm going to start rocking it and smacking it with my hand until it comes off of that column. Just make sure you got a good grip on it so it doesn't get away from you. And there it is. Then we'll pull that collar back off of there. Next, we're going to remove the pin that holds the tilt table at its angle. And there's a screw and a whole nother lock system in the table support under the table. We're just going to loosen that so that we can remove the table. We'll go ahead and pull those components out. And the table should just come off the table support like that. Next, you've got a protractor that sits under the table that tells you what angle it's sitting at. And we're going to remove that. It's got one screw that holds it in place. And then we can remove the table support. Next, we're going to loosen up the base lock screw and then lift the column straight out of the base. And set it aside. There's a shoe on the inside that we're going to get out of there. And then we can collect the base. So that's the major components. Here we're going to go ahead and just remove the lock for the table support. So just like all the other locks, it's got a screw, it's got a nut, and it's got a sleeve. And then we've got the table support lock that allows the table to tilt. So we're just going to remove the screw and then the sleeve. Easy peasy. Next, we're just going to disassemble the Quill lock handle from the lock screw. It's got a small set screw on it. There's your handle, screw, and set screw. Next, we're just going to remove the inner snap ring that's on the spindle pulley assembly. And there it is. Then we're going to spray some PB Blaster on that assembly where the bearings meet that shaft. Then we'll set that aside for now. So this is how we're going to remove the feed handle rod from the hub. We're just going to place it in a vise. I've got nylon jaws in this vise, so it won't mar them up. And just turn it off of there. There you go. And next we're just going to remove the knobs from the feed handle rods. And one of these was on there really good, so I couldn't get a good grip on it with the gloves. It just didn't want to come, so we'll put the knob in the vise. And then we'll use a pair of vise grips on the rod, like so. Then we can spin that knob right off of there. So I said that these two feed stop collars are incorrect. And what somebody has done is they've come with a punch and boogered the threads across the top of this feed stop rod so that these won't come off of the rod for some reason. But we're going to get them off of there. Vice grips. And we just got to be careful that we don't strip the rod. Not worried about the collars. We can get nuts that will do the same thing, no problem. The thread on this is a 5/8 by 18. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the pinion from the hub. And we're just going to use a 1/4-inch punch and drive out that pin. One end of that pin is splined, and so we're driving it so that the splined end is coming out first. And then the hub should just slide off of there. And then the spring should come right out of the pinion, like so. So we can go ahead and remove the chuck from the spindle quill assembly. And for this, we're just going to put a large Allen wrench inside the chuck. Make sure that the flats of the Allen wrench line up with the flats of the jaws. Tighten that down. Then we'll put the Allen wrench inside the vise. And we're going to use a spanner wrench to remove the safety lock collar on the chuck. I've got a whole video about the Jacobs chuck, how to install them and remove them, disassemble them and everything, and I'll put a link here for it. And there's also information in that video on where to get this spanner wrench. And there we go. So we'll go ahead and remove that feed stop bracket off of the quill. And then we can remove the Allen wrench out of the chuck. Next, we're going to disassemble the Quill spindle assembly. This is the spindle collar. It has a cone point set screw that holds it in place on the spindle. And once we've got that out, that collar should come right off of there. Under that, there's a rubber washer or an O-ring, depending on the year and whether or not somebody has replaced it. I'm just going to use a paint scraper to separate that and pull it off of there. And then under that rubber washer, there is a spacer, a metal spacer or a shim. And we're going to do the same thing, remove it. And next we can just put the quill inside the vise, and then using a rubber or nylon mallet, we're going to drive the spindle down through the quill. And I've got a power supply that sits directly under this vise, and it's hitting that, so I've got to play around with how I've got it in the vise to get it out of there, but no big deal. And once we get close to the end here, to drive it through that bearing, we're just going to use a brass punch. You can see that bottom bearing starting to come out of the quill. And we'll just use that punch. And there we go. So next we're going to get that bearing out of the quill with a wooden dowel, like so. And then we're going to get the other bearing off of the spindle by just putting it in this vise and basically doing the same thing, driving the spindle through the bearing. And I'm pressing my leg under the vise to catch the spindle when it falls, so it doesn't hit the floor. So next we're going to go ahead and disassemble the spindle pulley assembly. This first bearing is pretty easy to get off of here. I'm just using a two-prong puller. But that second bearing, there's a spacer between the two bearings. And that second bearing is a bit of a chore, especially if everything is really tight like it is on this drill press. And tight's a good thing. Tight means less run out. So a little bit more PB blaster. I'm going to use 2 wrenches to wedge under this bearing and kind of bend them outward. Now we're not going to bend the pulley. We're not even going to bend the edges of the pulley. We're just trying to lift up on the bearing. Once we've got it up enough that we can get this puller under it, we're good. And once we've got all that stuff lined up, we can start cranking on that puller and it'll pull the bearing off of there. And to make this easier, we'll just put the puller inside the vise. I'm just checking it every so often to make sure that it's not forcing the pulley down on the edge of that vise or anything like that to damage it. Next, we're going to disassemble the chuck. So I've got the jaws on this chuck protruding about 1/2 inch, and I've got a socket sitting over them. And then I'm just using a piece of pipe or a coupler that I got from like Home Depot. And it's just about the same inside diameter as the sleeve. And all we're going to do is compress this in a vise to push the sleeve off of the chuck body. So once we've got it lined up good, and there you go. And if you don't get it all the way, then you're going to have to put it back in the vise and get it until it pops right there. And then we can slide the sleeve off and then the split nut and then pull the jaws out. And that's how you disassemble a Jacob's chuck. Next, we're going to just remove the motor mount from the motor. And there you go. And then we're going to remove the pulley from the motor. So we get that set screw out of there, see if it's going to come off of there. It's on there pretty good. So we'll shoot some PB blaster in there. Just want to make sure that shaft is not mushroomed out, because that'll keep that pulley from coming off of there. We'll spray some down in the hole that the set screw was in, and then a little bit between the pulley and the motor itself. And then we should be able to use a piece of bar stock and just pry that pulley right off of there, like so. That's going to wrap up this video. In part 3, we'll go ahead and disassemble the motor and take apart a couple more things. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. There are a few links in the description of this video that you might find helpful, including a link to the owner's manual for this drill press. As always, I appreciate the support, and I will see you next time.